It's Black August. I am a poor historian because I did not know that Black August originated in the California Penal Institution in 1970. I just found that out, but that is perfect because today I want to talk about the Attica Uprising of 1971, which is probably the most significant prison uprising that we've had in the United States. Attica is a maximum security prison facility just outside of Buffalo in New York. The conditions in Attica are worse than most prisons, surprisingly. The men ate and were fed on 63 cents per day per inmate. That's how much they spent on food. There were barely any books for education. There were 2 doctors for the entire prison of 1,600 inmates. Not only were these doctors incredibly neglectful and racist, but they also allowed outside doctors to conduct experiments on the prisoners. The prisoners would sign a waiver, and in return for extra wages for the day, they would be tested. Their immune system would be tested for a virus that would not be treated. They tried as much as possible to democratically protest and let their grievances be known when it came to the condition of the prisons. They tried several tactics. One of them was a metal worker strike. Something important to know is that Attica Prison had made $1.2 million between 1969 and 1970 off of prison labor. Despite this, most prisoners made no more than 6 cents a day. On top of that, white prisoners were paid more than black prisoners for some odd reason. The metal workers decided that they were not going to work that day to protest not only the extremely low wages, but the fact that the prison held back half of their wages until they were free. This did not go over well, and all of these prisoners were punished. This led to another revolt. 450 more metal workers decided to go on strike. Keep in mind, this is a prison. This is not your job. This is a place where they have complete and power over you and control. 450 metal workers decide to strike and not work. The commissioner comes down. He says, don't worry, don't punish these men. Let's give them these wages. Let's see if we can address other things. As soon as the commissioner leaves, they punish the men either way. The next thing that happens is they send a letter to the commissioner. The commissioner at this time, his name is Oswald. The prisoners send a letter with a list of demands. Demands are basic. We want better food. We want better wages. We want doctors who actually care about us and will take our needs seriously. We want religious freedom. The commissioner takes this in and notes that the letter says that we want to do this democratically and peacefully and hope that you will meet us in these standards. The commissioner agrees and says he'll address these things. Many of these things are never addressed. On August 22nd of 1971, just weeks before the uprising, the prisoners managed to organize a multicultural, multiracial, spiritual sit-in. They are sitting in and refusing to eat to protest the murder of a prisoner named George Jackson, who was murdered the day before at San Quentin Prison for an alleged escape. The prisoners do not believe that George Jackson was murdered because of an escape. It does not check out to them. And they feel that COs would murder prisoners with impunity and find any reason to excuse it. So it made them very nervous, and George Jackson was very important to them. This made the COs and the staff very nervous because a multicultural alliance that spans religion and racial boundaries means that something is afoot, and the alarms in the prison are going off proverbially. Now, the actual riot that started the uprising was not planned. There was disrupt the night before, and the morning of September 9th, a CO had been tasked, a newer CO, with taking a company of men to the mess hall. The COs were staffed poorly and understaffed and had to take more companies of men than were safe. So this CO was staffed with taking a company of men, and he was told to not let one prisoner out. His name was William Ortiz. Do not open the gates for William Ortiz. We have a bone to pick with him. When this CO did not open the gate for William Ortiz, it set off alarms for other prisoners, and they refused to leave their cells unless Ortiz was let out to go to the mess hall to eat. the CO just decided to wrangle the rest of the prisoners and send them along to the mess hall. One of the prisoners manages to open Ortiz's cell and lets him out. He files out, and the rest of the prisoners file out as well, and they make their way to the mess hall, and they assume that all is forgotten. Ortiz is eating with them. The CO alerts the staff. The staff takes security measures to close certain prison gates that are left open for Gen Pop when they're moving around because there's so much movement at the time. They had not explained to the other COs that the security measure was being taken. So at one point, one CO tries to take his company of men into the yard and gets to the gate, sees that it's locked, does not have the keys. This makes the prisoners panic. They think that they are being cornered by COs for reprisals, for the COs to do whatever they want with them behind the gates. Another CO approaches them to figure out what's happening. He has no idea what's going on. They assume he is there to attack them, so they decide to attack him first. The clever CO, they take his keys, and they take the keys of the other CO, and panic breaks loose. It's chaos from that point on. The prisoners take COs, they take their keys, they open up gates, they free prisoners. They're robbing medicine cabinets, they're attacking each other. Of course they're attacking COs. One of the ones who suffered the worst is a man named William Quinn, who was hit over the head with something like a 2x4, it's assumed, and he's jumped and trampled and unconscious. But something amazing also happens in that the COs who treated the prisoners like humans are protected by certain inmates. Certain inmates actually go as far as to pretend to take the CO hostage to keep harm from coming to this CO who treated them like people. A man named Richard X. Clark comes into a part where COs are left hiding and badly beaten and need desperate medical attention, including William Quinn, who is beaten beyond recognition. He organizes men, he takes them into a room that the staff can get to without getting to the rest of the prison, that still keeps the other prisoners safe. He lays Quinn on a mattress with the other COs and lets the staff know on the other side of the gate, these men need medical attention, take them away as soon as I leave the room, which he does. And they manage to take these men out of the prison and get them into hospitals. They reconvene in the yard, and in the yard the prisoners realize that this riot has to be something more, that this riot can be an uprising. This is a way to leverage our demands, the things that we need, the basic human rights that we feel we deserve, so we must use this moment wisely. So they get organized. They elect a committee to be the interface between the prison and the staff. They create a security force, and the security force surrounds the hostages that they have taken, locked arm in arm, to make sure that no harm comes to them. They create a medical station, and with the little training that they have, they tend to the hostages, and they tend to other inmates and all the medical needs that they have. They decide that everything will be done by vote, that this is a democracy, and that no one person will speak for all inmates. Everything will be voted on, down to the very last, smallest decision. The committee convenes and hammers out a list of demands, and they finally arrive at 28 mostly practical demands. The same basic demands you heard before, which is better food. They want more fruit and less pork. They want religious freedom. They want a lack of censorship. They want access to books. And they want doctors who give a shit. One of the brilliant things that they do is they decide that they need an observers committee. They make a list of reporters, lawyers, also advocates and activists from the Black and brown communities, and state assemblymen in the legislature and senators. And they compile this list on their own, and they give it to the commissioner. And what this does is this gives them a group of advocates, witnesses, and a buffer between them and the state. The commissioner's name is Oswald, like I said before, and he was actually pro-reform. He wanted to reform prisons and think they should be in better state. But he was skeptical that this was basically a left-wing black militant plot to just sow discord, and was not certain that the grievances were from a pure place. Despite that, he put the Observers Commission together. He successfully does this, and they come in and day out to negotiate with the prisoners, to advise them and to help them hammer out these 28 demands and tell them what's realistic, what's going to work, and what's not going to work. Oswald himself actually attends one of them, but this proves to be a turning point, because when the men had sent their demands to Oswald before in a peaceful, democratic manner and expected a response, instead of meeting with them as was discussed, he decided to send a taped recording. This did not go over well. So when Oswald was in the D yard where the men had gathered, one of the prisoners had yelled out, "We should take Oswald hostage." This is the point where chaos should have ensued, but it did not. What they did was they took a vote, and they said, "How many men think we should take Oswald hostage?" Very few hands went up. Oswald was left to go unscathed, but he vowed to never go back into the D yard. Now, the inmates were smart. They also had the press come in. The press came in and interviewed hostages. To their surprise, the hostages talked highly about the treatment that they were getting from the people holding them hostage, from these animals, these criminals, these inmates. They told them that they were sleeping on mattresses when other inmates were sleeping on the floor, that they were getting food, that they were being covered for the rain while others were out in the open, and that they were getting medical attention and all the supplies that they needed. And they begged the administration, and specifically the governor, to come and give the prisoners what they want and grant them amnesty, because that was one of the things that they had asked for. Amnesty proved to be the biggest obstacle and possibly the breakdown of negotiations. What the men asked for with the 28th list of items was amnesty from crimes committed during the riots. Now, the commission could not convince any judge or district attorney to give this to them. Some judges just said they wouldn't. Some said it was not within their power. And the men knew that without this amnesty, they'd have nothing, because unfortunately, the CO, the correctional officer that they tried to save, William Quinn, that they handed over to the staff, died in the hospital of his injuries. Without this, none of the demands meant anything, because they were all on the hook for murder. They asked that the governor come down and lend legitimacy to this and see the prison and understand that their grievances were fair and just. No one could convince Governor Nelson Rockefeller to come down to the prison. He could not be convinced at all. Why? He was a Republican, and he did not want to look soft in Nixon's law and order administration, and he wanted to be president one day. Nelson Rockefeller decided that the prison would have to be taken back by force, even though it may cause casualties. And the night of September 12th, he gave the green light. He would rather take it back than negotiate with criminals. On the morning of the 13th, the inmates knew something was wrong, because the Observers Committee had not come back to renegotiate as promised the day before. They got desperate. They decided to make a last-ditch effort. They walked 8 of the hostages up onto the catwalk of the D yard so that they could be seen. They covered their faces so that they could not be identified, and they held makeshift weapons to their necks, and they said, "Oswald, if you do not send the committee back in to continue negotiations as promised, the blood of these men's lives are on your hands." Secretly, they had told the hostages that this was a bluff. One of the hostages recalls afterwards that he was scared until his taker had told him, even with the makeshift weapon to his neck, "Don't worry, boss, it's all just for show." Another man named Mike Smith, when he realized that his hostage taker had been a man who had protected him from the beginning of the uprising from harm, he was relieved. They talked about what would happen if the state would storm it, and if they survived, would they survive? They told each other, they made a promise. If one of us makes it out, the other would tell that person's family, deliver them a message, and tell them that they were loved. They exchanged personal information on the spot to ensure this. Just at that moment, the sound of a very large helicopter comes over the yard. Some of the men think, because of how large this helicopter is, it must be Rockefeller, and he's ready to talk, and they start clapping and cheering. At this point, they hear from a megaphone, "Put your hands on your head, surrender to the nearest officer, and you will not be harmed." The men, of course, put their hands on their head, and they say it again. At this point, a fine white powder drops from the helicopter onto the yard. It's a gas. It's a mix of CS and CN gas that debilitates you as soon as you come into contact with it, and it turns your insides out. It was so powerful that the observers in the room, sealed with the windows shut, still felt the effects. Now, Rockefeller had decided that the National Guard, who was trained at these things, at diffusing these and taking over prisons before, would not be the ones to take the prison back. He tasked the state troopers instead, who had zero training with anything like this, but they were angry. One of the state troopers had a brother who was a hostage, and another state trooper told him, I don't know if we're going to get to your brother in time, but we're going in anyway. They gave these troopers rifles they had no training with. They erased the serial numbers and did not record which rifle was given to which trooper. The troopers removed any insignia or identifying material from their uniforms, and they stormed the prison. And as soon as they got in, they began shooting indiscriminately. It was an absolute massacre. At 10:05, they reported that the prison was secure, yet shots were still fired by 10:24. One prisoner was shot 12 times at close range. All in all, 128 prisoners were shot. 29 prisoners died, and 9 hostages were killed. Now, what did the state do after this? When the press came and said, what happened? They asked the Department of Correction Services, Deputy Director of Communication, how did the hostages die? And he said, I believe that the inmates slit their throats. And they said, all of the hostages? And he said, yes. This had not been discussed before. Walter Dunbar, who also worked for the DOCS, gave a tour to the legislature and showed them the aftermath and said, I personally saw a prisoner who, rather than give up his hostage to a state trooper, plunged a knife into his stomach. I saw it with my own eyes. The governor's office released a statement and said that several hostages had been dead for hours before they stormed, and that's why they had to retake the prison. Governor Rockefeller told Nixon on the phone that the blacks had started this, and he had to go in and end it. The news ran off with these stories. They reported the gruesome murders by prisoners who were animals who slashed throats rather than be taken by the state. They also reported that William Quinn, who the prisoners had tried to save, who had died in the hospital, had been thrown out of the window. Now, the state troopers and the Department of Correctional Services did not think that state troopers would go in and fire indiscriminately and were not prepared for this scene at all. It took them an hour to contact medical services for backup. When medical services arrived, one of the doctors who had been in World War II said he had never seen more people in neglect than this scene that he was looking at. At this point, they finally get prisoners to the medical examiner, but all of them are escorted by state troopers, and state troopers are on the scene when the medical examiner examines the bodies. They want the medical examiner to find some other cause of death than gunshot wounds, because we know that the prisoners had no guns. The examiner does not find anything other than gunshot wounds. All prisoners and all hostages were shot and killed by state troopers and snipers on the roof. They were all murdered by the state in the retaking of the prison. Despite this, a grand jury convened after finds dozens of inmates guilty of crimes and 0 troopers or state officials. When the uprising had started, the main group that they had voted had signified the beginning in chalk and the yard. They noted the date. After the state troopers had taken over the yard, they took up the chalk and they wrote their own message. It said, retaken September 13th, 1971, 31 dead niggers. Just in case you think it had nothing to do with race. What the state wanted you to believe is that these men were animals and that they killed indiscriminately, and that their grievances when it came to better wages, to medical care, to better food, and to be treated like decent human beings, that these men who looked out for each other, who some of the inmates covered the hostages during the siege of the prison and saved their lives, that these men were simply criminals and deserved everything that they got. If these men are criminals, then what does that make the state? My prompt for you: where did you learn the definition of criminal? Who did you learn it from? And what purpose does it serve? Does the definition of criminal in the United States serve to protect you from crime, violence, harm? Or does it obscure the humanity of people just like you? And that's it.